Um, I had a 40-year association with Professor Béteille. It began in 1985 and lasted till the day he passed away. Our relationship traversed my status as a student through MA and MPhil, to Béteille being my supervisor for my PhD. Later, we were colleagues when I was teaching at the university, and I was privileged to share a genuine and warm friendship with him. Béteille was the sounding board I could go to for both sage advice and to crib about the world. And he, in turn, never shied from calling to say he wanted to meet or to make a plan to go for a walk or eat idli and vada or whatever. While my relationship with him evolved over the years, some of his values remained consistent. He respected young people as individuals with ideas. What he expected was clarity in the articulation and formulation of those ideas. Béteille brought the same clarity of thought and sharpness of analysis to all issues, be it the chapter of the thesis, or in later years, a discussion on Federer versus Nadal, or whether we should put milk into the cup before tea or vice versa. In his passing, Indian sociology has lost one of its most productive scholars, whose academic life began in 1959, when at the age of 25, having transitioned from studying physics to anthropology to his first position at the ISI, Béteille found his home in sociology at the Delhi School of Economics. M.N. Srinivas wasted no time in getting Béteille started on teaching, sending him almost alongside his appointment letter the syllabus for the course on political sociology. And I'm glad we spoke a bit about his lecture notes, because Béteille told me that in the early years, when he wrote those lecture notes, he would go and show them to Srinivas to check if he was on the right track. The classroom was Béteille's favorite space. He enjoyed teaching and always came well prepared. He regarded teaching as an essential means of practicing and maintaining touch with the discipline, not a chore to be done before devoting time to research. He would take the first class of the day, and any of us who have been in his class would recall his putting down the structure of the lecture on the board in his neat and distinctive handwriting. The three pillars of teaching, research, and service to the university have been spoken about by different people this evening, but these were very strongly entrenched in Béteille's philosophy of what it meant to be an academic. He attributed this to Srinivas, who required academics to contribute on all three fronts. Teaching did not lead him to neglect research. His output was prolific, and his overwork consisted of 23 books and numerous articles and lectures. Writing for him required rigor, from where work would emerge slowly but surely. The writing was part of his daily routine, and in the last few weeks some people have spoken about it, but writing 250 to 500 words in longhand every day was what he did. And until he finally moved to the laptop around 2005, the first draft of everything he published was in his own hand. It allowed him time to think and correct as he wrote, before keying it in on his trusted Olivetti typewriter. He showed through practice that his research and publishing output was higher than that of people who worked either as full-time writers or at institutions with no teaching duties, which basically meant none of us could complain about not having time to write because he was doing it. Béteille was the first PhD of the Department of Sociology at DSE. He was amongst the earliest set of scholars embarking on village studies, following the lead of Redfield. But he moved away from the general description of the village, and I think many people have spoken about his first work. But his focus on social stratification or social inequality, Srinivas warned him, would get him in trouble with his PhD examiners. But he stuck to his guns nonetheless. He believed at that stage, and I continued to believe, that stratification was to sociology what kinship was to anthropology. And he tried to establish the centrality of stratification to the discipline of sociology. We've heard about Max Weber, and it is in the PhD where he leant towards Max Weber's analytical ideas. And he said later that even though it resulted in him being labeled a Weberian, it was a description he never repudiated. In my own work, it was my desire to work on ethnicity theory that led Béteille to supervise the dissertation. For my MPhil, he pointed me towards Soviet ethnography, and my dissertation became a contrast of the patterns of ethnicity in the US, USSR, and India, an exercise in the comparative perspective, which was one of Béteille's most powerful tools. When I chose to do my fieldwork in Belgaum, Karnataka, not an area to which I belong, Béteille was intrigued, but he saw the parallel with his own work in Tamil Nadu. He had learnt a new language. My challenge was to learn too. We talked about how few Indian students spent any length of time in the field and how urban India remained a neglected space for ethnographic studies. The hallmark of Béteille's supervision was the meticulousness and swiftness with which he read and returned written work. Every grammatical error and unclear passage was marked, and he would go over each comment at the subsequent meeting. His focus was always on clarity of articulation, not for him the turgid, convoluted, and obscure style that some academics employ as proof of scholarship. We met once a week, and he expected one chapter every month. He was never condescending or patronizing, always gently nurturing and guiding, giving respect and naturally receiving it in return. Once our meetings ended, we would move to the cafe, where it was established very early on that we would take turns to pay. That system prevailed long after the supervisions were over, and the dynamics of our relationship changed, as did the location of meetings to his home or elsewhere. When the PhD was awarded, Béteille wanted me to publish my monograph. He knew from experience that scholars who published articles rarely published the book. In this, I disappointed him. I decided to write not the monograph he wanted, but a millennial history of Indian society. Béteille understood my passion for that project and engaged with it, as would an interested friend. Soon after my PhD, I also did a course on ethnographic filmmaking with the visual anthropologist David McDougall. A bemused Béteille said nothing at the time, but did allow me to film him the week he retired. His last lecture, the function for his fetch drift, and then his farewell function. When I eventually came back to my monograph, I decided to expand my analysis to look more closely at the link between ethnicity and class. Béteille was surprised by this desire to do more work, but pleased, given its alignment to his own work. His pleasure at the end result was summed up in the preface, where he voiced both his own shortcomings as a field worker and lavished praise on me for having taken forward the work he had started in '64. Béteille also wrote prolifically for the newspapers, believing that such writing enabled him to explain sociological reasoning to a wider audience. He did not set out to position himself as a public intellectual, but that is what he was, well before the term gained currency. I'm glad that in 2000 I was able to convince him to publish his newspaper articles as a book, and the first one, Chronicles of Our Time, came out then. His writing for the newspapers illustrated another of his strong convictions, his focus on social analysis rather than social policy formation. He was clear that sociology's strengths lay in policy analysis and social criticism rather than policy prescription. He avoided being judgmental and preferred instead to use, it's a phrase anyone who's been with Béteille or read him knows, judgments of fact on the issues being considered rather than value judgments. As to institution building, I know Professor Deepak Nayyar spoke about it. One could be forgiven for thinking that something with such a prolific output might bypass mundane administrative work, not Béteille. An awareness of the building on the disciplinary and institutional foundations set by Srinivasan K. and Raj and others permeated his practice. He took committee work seriously. And whenever I complained of too many committees, he was quick to say, we all have to do our bit for the institution. In 1993, I set up the Department of Sociology at LSR College, and my conversations with Béteille turned to various dimensions of the public university system. Béteille was, he continued to support our department in those early years. He would drop in whenever we asked him to. His stint as chairman ICCR and his exposure to other modes of universities were immensely insightful. My stint at Nalanda paralleled his stint with Ashoka, so we had a lot of time discussing universities in those years. Just before I close, Béteille was not someone who would give catchy titles to books or his essays. But I think of the various things he did, he would be proud, and he was very proud of a few things, becoming an FBA, the National Professor, and the Padma Bhushan. And he was also very proud of the fact that he had stood up to do more and his description of Indian society. I will close with a short anecdote about a nostalgic trip I took with Béteille in 2014 to St. Michael's High School in Patna. He had written in his memoirs about how miserable he was during his 2 years at the school. He had never returned since. But on this visit, we spent a happy and emotional morning revisiting the places of his childhood, wondering how far he had come. I learned a great deal from this long association with Béteille: the seriousness of teaching, the exactness of writing, the respect with which he treated all people, and most of all, how our conversations had a delightful way of taking us on unexpected journeys. Thanks.
Thank you.